For decades, Laurel and Hardy made millions of people chuckle. We're the golden boys of Hollywood, packing theaters all over the world. But there was a sinister secret hidden behind the grins. Stan Laurel had about $2,000 in his bank account when he passed away, despite making millions for studios. Oliver Hardy's costly divorces and gambling addiction cost him everything. Comedy Gold's founders never owned a single movie they produced. While struggling to pay their bills, the studios became wealthy. America's favorite comedians had been betrayed in this way. On June 16, 1890, Arthur Stanley Jefferson, later known as Stan Laurel, was born in the Lancashire town of Ulverston. Arthur Jefferson, his father, was a well-known manager, playwright, and vaudeville entrepreneur who operated a number of theaters in northern England. The Jefferson family did not have an easy life. In order to conserve money, they frequently resorted to take in other players as boarders, cramming themselves into tiny spaces, according to an 1891 census. Even though his mother Madge was a performer, variety performances hardly ever earned more than a worker's salary. Nevertheless, Stan's early years were dominated by the theater industry. While other kids his age were transported to workhouses, he spent his childhood playing in prop rooms and witnessing rehearsals from behind the curtains. Norval Hardy was born in Harlem, Georgia on January 18, 1892, 2 years later. Later on, the world would know him as Oliver Hardy. His father passed away before he was even a year old, therefore his life started out tragically. Emily, his mother, supported the family by operating a motel amid a post-Civil War South that was still having difficulties. With high infant mortality rates and yellow fever outbreaks, the times were challenging. To keep goats away, Emily even had to round the clotheslines with barbed wire. Because of his round cheeks, the youngster was known as Babe. He would spend hours watching silent comedies at the local theater to find solace. He began singing with minstrel armies at the age of 8, earning some cash to support his family. He was a gentle youngster whose laughter would one day cover the grief of his early loss, and others subsequently recalled seeing him visit his father's cemetery by himself. Stan's father was a prominent person in the English entertainment industry, in addition to being a theater management. Stan was already leading a life behind the scenes that most kids could only imagine by the time he was 6 years old. He drew in prop rooms, spent evenings in theatrical lofts, and observed talented actors like Vesta Tilley practicing. When his father leased Glasgow's Metropole Theatre in 1897, young Stan plunged himself into the world of theater. When he should have been studying, he practiced routines, put on blackface for minstrel acts, and assisted with scenery. Because he liked comedy more than lessons, his lack of focus was frequently mentioned in his school papers. He had already written his own sketches by the time he was 15 and was doing pantomimes as Stan Jefferson. While many of his peers had never even stepped foot on a stage, he was making a living as a comedy actor by 1906. Oliver Hardy, on the other hand, shown unexpected athletic ability while still a teenager. He was a standout football player and even a promising baseball pitcher at Georgia Military College around 1907. Some thought he may make it to the major leagues. He could swim well, too. Been given credit for preventing the drowning of 2 kids in Sweetwater Creek. Oliver enrolled to the University of Georgia, primarily to don the team's red and black jersey, despite his mother's wish that he would pursue a career in law. But he didn't do well in school. He even slept in the locker room and frequently skipped lectures to practice with the band. His aspirations for fame ultimately drove him to sing in silent movie theaters, a move that would forever alter his life. When Stan Laurel, aged 22 years old, joined Fred Carnot's London Comedians in 1912, it was his big break. When he had met Carnot in Leicester Square, he had been on the verge of famine. Carnot was well known for requiring rehearsals to be flawless, often lasting up to 8 hours each day. When the troops sailed to America that October aboard the SS Carnrona, Stan became Charlie Chaplin's understudy and slept in the same small bunk as him. They played the sketch, Mumming Birds, over 700 times throughout the U.S. tour, often performing 3 shows in one day. Stan filled in for Chaplin, who was unable to perform due to nervousness in front of hostile American audiences. His unwavering discipline and comedic timing, which would later come to define his career, accompanied him to America until 1927. Oliver Hardy's journey took a dramatic turn at about the same time. Oliver took on all duties when his mother founded the first movie theater in Milledgeville, Georgia in 1910. He handled ticket sales, projector operation, cleaning, and management. He saw every silent movie that was released, sometimes 40 times, and instead of studying law. Persuaded that he could outperform many of the actors on screen, he relocated to Jacksonville, Florida in 1913, which at the time had about 30 studios and was a thriving hub for silent film. He performed in vaudeville at night and worked as an extra during the day there. Outwitting Dad, his debut feature picture, came out in 1914. For someone who had just been operating a small-town theater 2 years prior, he had already made 50 appearances in short films for the Lubin Studio by 1915. Stan had a very poor start to his solo career in American movies. He starred in a number of unimpressive silent shorts between 1917 and 1921, including Nuts in May in 1917 and Phony Photos in 1918. His performances were deemed uninspiring and too similar to Chaplin's by critics. Trade papers began making fun of him, and at the time, his parody, The Lucky Dog 1921, in which he featured, did not receive much notice. These days, many of these movies are gone, surviving only on paycheck documents. Laurel felt overshadowed by Chaplin and battled typecasting. His career didn't start to improve until Hal Roach brought him into the studio in 1926. Oliver, however, created a vast corpus of work, the majority of which was overlooked. He starred in around 250 silent shorts for studios such as Vim and Lubin between 1914 and 1926. It was a tiring pace, requiring up to 4 films in some weeks. Due to nitrate deterioration and inadequate storage, almost 150 of his films are currently lost. His big frame made him an obvious choice for physical comedy, and he was frequently placed in supporting parts or as the heavy. He even portrayed the Tin Man in the now mostly forgotten silent 1925 adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. Until Hal Roach coupled him with Stan in 1927, Hardy's name was rarely seen on posters, and his fame remained unattainable despite all of this effort. Strangely enough, the two guys had met years before. They co-starred in the silent comedy short The Lucky Dog in December 1921. Hardy portrayed a bumbling robber, and Laurel played a man who was struggling. The movie was shot in late 1920 or early 1921, according to historians. Utilizing trade documents and vehicle registrations as proof, it had no effect on their careers at the time. Both later acknowledged that they didn't remember the incident at all. 6 more years would pass before they were formally partnered, which is a startlingly long time given their ideal chemistry. Hollywood's Hal Roach Studios was teaming with talent in 1926, but an accidental overlap produced something remarkable. They had just rehired Stan Laurel, primarily to create and direct short comedies, not as an actor. Babe, whose real name is Oliver Hardy, also joined on as a performer at the same time. Neither guy could have predicted that this combination would result in one of the greatest comedic combinations ever. They initially collaborated on different projects for Roach's All-Stars series. Audiences recognized how their disparate personas complemented one another as they gradually started to feature in the same shorts. Later on, Hal Roach acknowledged that everything was an accident, claiming that if the 3 of them hadn't met at the appropriate time and location, it would never have worked. The actual pivotal moment was brought about by director Leo McCarey. He noticed something that others overlooked when collaborating with them on group initiatives. The comedy seemed to flow naturally whenever Laurel and Hardy were together. Hardy's irritable and controlling personality contrasted perfectly with Laurel's innocent childlikeness. McCarey chose to write gags that positioned them together rather than apart in order to highlight their relationship. He even made a routine out of his annoyance at a poorly tied bow tie, something Hardy found difficult to do. The frenzied pace of their comedy eased under McCarey, allowing the humor to be carried by timing and character. He is credited by many as being the first to realize that they were more powerful as a group than as individuals. Putting Pants on Philip, their first formal collaboration, debuted on December 3, 1927. In the short, Hardy played Stan, a Scottish bumpkin in a kilt who continuously embarrasses his well-dressed uncle. There were many comedy elements in the movie, such as frenzied city chases It was the start of their recognizable duo act, even though it wasn't yet the exact look that made them famous. They molded the characters that viewers grew to love over the course of the following movies. transforming ordinary scenes into some of the most iconic comedic moments ever. Stan Laurel became the driving force behind the camera. Laurel threw himself into every aspect while Hardy relaxed at the golf course. He spent many evenings watching film reels, planning humor, writing scripts, and directing scenes without getting credit. He was acknowledged as the principal author and creative force by 1929. Hal Roach acknowledged that if Laurel rejected a concept, it was promptly dropped, demonstrating his perfectionism. Laurel's incessant work, frequently to the point of weariness, provided their films with the humor and rhythm that set them apart. Their victory was swift. Less than 2 years after their debut, they had already gained international recognition by the end of 1929. Everywhere there was a movie theater. Their theme music and faces were recognizable. Even before many theaters had sound, their comedies were major hits in Europe. They filmed versions in French, German, Spanish, and Italian to reach a wider audience, frequently using 4 different languages to rehash the same scene. They became worldwide celebrities in record time because their physical humor was untranslatable. Their talkies were attracting enormous audiences in Paris, Berlin, Madrid, and Shanghai by the early 1930s. They transformed from near unknowns to global icons in less than a year. Laurel kept nearly all control over the creative side even as their fame increased. Laurel controlled the humor, supervised the screenplay, and even re-edited movies to achieve the ideal timing, even though the directors were given credit. Laurel's statement was final. Hal Roach confirmed. He frequently encouraged competition among his writers to make jokes funnier. Hardy did not participate in the planning process, but Laurel put forth a lot of effort and shaped every aspect. Although he was rarely given credit, many historians today concur that he was the real director behind the scenes. With the invention of the music box in 1932, they achieved a new milestone. On November 18, 1932, they won Hollywood's first Academy Award for Best Live-Action Short Film for The Tale, which revolved around carrying a piano up a long flight of stairs. Producer Hal Roach was the official recipient of the prize, which was a parchment scroll rather than a trophy. Nevertheless, it was an incredible privilege. A historic landmark in Los Angeles, the staircase utilized in the movie is still standing today. A reminder of their influence that endures. In just 13 years, from 1927 to 1940, Laurel and Hardy produced an astounding 76 projects, including 60 shorts and 16 features. That was a lot more than other comedians at the time. Over 6 a year. Among their most well-known pieces from this era are Way Out West, 1937, Sons of the Desert, 1933, and Big Business, 1929. They occasionally recorded in various languages while phonetically reading lines from cue cards in order to maximize earnings. They were one of the most successful collaborations in Hollywood history due to their unrelenting pace. However, success did not equate to a simple life. Oliver Hardy began to struggle with gambling in the 1930s. Additionally, he had multiple marriages that ended with costly alimony payments. Both guys were far from rich by the 1950s. In order to settle debts, Hardy even consented to a challenging live tour in England, but it was cut short due to his deteriorating health. In contrast to the glitzy existence people had expected, he lived out his later years in a modest house in the San Fernando Valley. The two never received a portion of the ownership or long-term income from any of their films. Regardless of the box office performance of their films, they received a predetermined weekly salary. Hardy made $80,806 during the year 1936. Laurel earned $135,000, however. Even while such amounts were substantial at the time, they paled in comparison to the millions their films brought in. The startling reality of their success was revealed when Laurel acknowledged that by the conclusion of their careers, he had only $2,000 left in his bank account. Projects were occasionally on the verge of failure due to Laurel's perfectionism. He had a heated argument with Hal Roach during Babes in Toyland in 1934, reworking sections while the movie was already in progress. As he tested and retested fresh gags, entire schedules fell behind. Despite the studio's frustration with the delays, his meticulousness made sure the two filmmakers' films were unique. But Hal Roach used cunning strategies to maintain power. He made sure their contracts didn't expire simultaneously. As a result, they were unable to collectively negotiate for increased compensation or creative rights. They have little leverage if one contract dissolved because the other was still locked in. Roach gained complete control thanks to this tactic, which also caused friction in their collaboration. When Stan Laurel sued the studio in 1937 and refused to work until he had more power, things reached a breaking point. In response, Roach fired him and cast Hardy in the 1939 movie Zenobia alongside Harry Langdon. Many fans believed the partnership was permanently terminated after being stunned. Roach only managed to reunite them following months of court cases and Zenobia's failure. Laurel was greatly affected by the episode, particularly since Hardy had remained with the studio and carried on without him. Since the magic was obviously absent when Hardy performed with others, many people perceived this as a betrayal. Laurel felt alone as he had to defend both their partnership and his rights. Roach even planned a new series, The Hardy Family, in the interim. The plan to replace Laurel with child star Spanky McFarland and actress Patsy Kelly was rejected by fans and never materialized. The world was astonished when Laurel and Hardy abruptly left Hal Roach Studios in 1940 at the height of their glory. Since 1926, they had constructed more than 70 comedies here, movies that had won them a devoted following all over the world. There, Stan Laurel in particular had had a great deal of flexibility to shape each gag, every word, and even the filming of certain situations. Audiences came to see Roach perform favorites like Sons of the Desert and Way Out West. Despite continuing to work together in name, Hal Roach and Stan had such a sour relationship after the 1934 release of Babes in Toyland that Roach vowed never to work directly with Stan again. By 1940, studio meddling and acrimonious disagreements over creative credit had reached an intolerable level. The two left Saps at sea with the hope of gaining more creative control. Ironically, the same independence they were seeking would be taken away from them if they signed with the big studios MGM and 20th Century Fox. In May 1941, they signed their first significant contract with 20th Century. Although it initially appeared to be a positive step, the reality was heartbreaking. They were prohibited from creating their own content for the first time in their professional lives. On Fridays, they were given scripts, and by Monday, they were supposed to know every line by heart. The days of Stan acting as a kind of director, rewriting and improvising until the comedy seemed right, were long gone. The formula's failure was demonstrated by their first Fox movies, Great Guns, 1941, and A Haunting, We Will Go, 1942. The spark vanished without their imaginative touch. Later, Laurel claimed that going from complete involvement to being treated like hired actors was a tremendous shock. The pair that had previously produced some of the most creative comedies ever made were suddenly unable to influence the production of their own films. They did receive the biggest budgets of their careers from Fox and MGM, which were frequently between $300,000 and $450,000 per movie. A significant improvement over the Roach years, but the pictures were not made better by the funding. It went toward paying producers, bloated supporting actors, and polished sets rather than creative slapstick or smart jokes. Both reviewers and devoted fans agreed that the duo's 8 films from 1941 to 1944, which brought in millions of dollars between them, were their worst. Stan Laurel later refused to view these movies because he was so dissatisfied with the outcome, referring to them as artistically deficient. Their appearance was altered as well. Audiences were left perplexed as the studios attempted to refresh their look and applied odd makeup. Only mediocrity had been purchased by the larger budgets. With the Bullfighters in 1945, things took a further turn for the worse. Studios were so indifferent by that point that they used repurposed video to fill sequences, including stealing shots from Blood and Sand, the Tyrone Power thriller. They used old jokes from their own previous shorts, such as Goodbye from 1934, and used stock footage to fill in the rest. Fox offered to reopen its entire B-movie division specifically for them when the movie proved to be a little smash, but the offer felt insulting. In order to avoid the embarrassment, Laurel and Hardy chose to buy out their contracts rather than continue, even though it meant losing money. Later on, Stan Laurel acknowledged that the studio years of the 1940s were the worst for our careers. In correspondence and interviews, he talked of feeling like a mere worker, deprived of the satisfaction that came from creating their craft. In contrast to the sincere laughter of their early days, he rejected those movies as pointless. In his later years, he advised people to go back and watch the classics rather than the studio productions. He said that he felt useless and powerless after losing his artistic voice. It wasn't only a creative deterioration. In an interview with the New Statesman in 1946, Laurel disclosed that he was barely making ends meet on $200 per month and had only $2,000 remaining in his bank account. Considering that Laurel and Hardy had sold out theaters all over the world and made millions for studios for 14 years in a row, it was startling. However, they were left with virtually nothing by the contracts they signed. Despite being well-known, they appeared to be making a meager livelihood. The situation was exacerbated by Oliver Hardy's personal difficulties. He became severely addicted to gambling and would frequently dash from the studio lots directly to the card tables or racetrack. He could lose everything in one night, even if he was making thousands a week. He was compelled to live in a modest San Fernando Valley home by the late 1940s due to his mounting debt, which was a far cry from the glitzy lifestyle that people had envisaged. Both guys endured painful divorces as well. Hardy had to plead with the courts for reductions when his income dropped below $1,000 per week after being ordered to pay his ex-wife $250 per week, which was a huge sum at the time. His finances were depleted by Laurel's several marriages, which required ongoing alimony and legal bills. A large portion of their latter work was done merely to fulfill unending responsibilities rather than to amass fortune. Their movies became popular on television in the 1950s, which only served to increase the brutality, and the 1960s, yet they received no profits from their contracts. Laurel and Hardy gained nothing from the replays as younger generations mocked their work. The men who had invented the magic watched from the sidelines, straining to make ends meet as studios and rights holders became wealthy. They were forced to take the stage again by the late 1940s. They played in small UK music halls from 1947 until the early 1950s, occasionally to mostly empty venues. The once great idols, who could hardly move without being accosted, now made just enough money to pay for their meals and transportation. Following a performance in Plymouth in 1954, Hardy had a heart attack on May 17th, on what would be their final tour. Laurel acknowledged that he couldn't continue without him, therefore the remaining concerts were canceled. It marked the end of their illustrious collaboration. Untold, their most recent movie, was a nightmare instead of a comeback. In France, production started on April 1, 1950 and continued for a full year. The set was hindered by language hurdles. Both Laurel and Hardy became gravely ill, and the director hardly spoke English. Laurel, who already had diabetes, was unable to work for more than 20 to 30 minutes at a time due to colitis, diarrhea, and a prostate ulcer. He lost 50 pounds and down to only 114 pounds after undergoing emergency prostate surgery twice. Hardy's condition did not improve. He gained 330 pounds, and during filming he had a heart attack. Chaos broke out in the $1.05 million production. Upon the film's eventual release in Europe in 1951, critics were appalled by the pair's fragile state. Only in 1954 did it make its way to the U.S. Even then, in a trimmed-down version, viewers knew this was the end because of the harsh reviews. Oliver Hardy's small heart attack in May 1954 caused great concern among his admirers and doctors. He took his health more seriously than ever before as a result of the scare, and the outcomes were shocking. Hardy shed more than 150 pounds, or roughly 68 kg, in a matter of months. The shift was so drastic that it totally altered his appearance. His friends, who had always known him as the cheerful man with the 350-pound body, were taken aback. Stan Laurel, his partner, said that it was unnerving to watch him like this. "The weight loss must be a sign of something more serious like cancer," some murmured. It seemed as though Hardy had lost not just his bulk, but also the very reputation that had brought him fame. What started off as an attempt to save his life quickly became a warning that he might never fully recover. Tragic events occurred once more 2 years later. On 14 September 1956, Hardy suffered a severe stroke. The man who used to fill theaters with laughter was now speechless and paralyzed. He was confined to his bed for months. The following year, he experienced 2 more severe strokes, leaving him dependent on the care of his loving wife, Lucille. He was left weaker than before each one. He eventually went into a coma. Once brimming with humor and recollection, Stan Laurel's visits turned became heartbreaking ones. Stan was unable to bring Hardy back to the world they had created together and was left to watch him fade away as he could only speak with his eyes. The stillness between them was nearly intolerable when Stan went to see Hardy following the strokes. They have been on the same stage for over 30 years. Created jokes and mastered the skill of entertaining others. Hardy was in bed now, unable to speak. Words were no longer important to Laurel, who was always the chatty character on film. They sat together in silence, occasionally crying and occasionally showing a hint of a smile. Their relationship was more powerful than words. They resorted to the same wordless gestures from their early flicks in those situations. It was a farewell that meant more to them than any scene they had ever performed. It was a last screenplay that no audience would ever see. After finally sliding into a coma due to the strokes, Oliver Hardy died on August 7, 1957, at the age of 65. Despite a lifetime of achievement, he had to sell his house to cover his medical expenses, and he passed away with little left. When a process server arrived with legal documents and saw Hardy near death, he declined to ask for his signature. Lucille remained with him in their North Hollywood home right up until the very end. Stan, who was grieving and not feeling well, was unable to make it to the funeral. Oh. Hardy's ashes were interred in Valhalla Memorial Park Cemetery's Masonic Garden, and one of the greatest comedy combos in history ended with his death. Stan Laurel stated softly, "That's the end of the history of Laurel and Hardy," in response to a question concerning Hardy's passing. He used Hardy's moniker Babe Would Understand to easily explain why he couldn't attend the burial. Laurel never made another appearance on stage or screen after that day. Over the years, he received numerous offers from Hollywood friends and producers, but he declined each and every one of them. It was impossible for him to execute without Hardy. They had always shared a stage, in his opinion, and it didn't feel right without his companion. Laurel remained to himself in retirement, but he was never bored. Writing comedy sketches, gags, and routines for the two of them, even though he knew they would never be performed again, took up his days at a well-kept desk. He was kind and considerate in his responses to fan messages, frequently surprised people with his kindness. Laurel never stopped thinking about comedy, according to friends like Dick Van Dyke, but he wouldn't talk about it. To him, it was exclusively Hardy's. At the age of 74, Stan Laurel passed away on February 23, 1965. He had avoided public life because he did not want others to see him in such a weak state, living in a little 3-room apartment in Santa Monica. He had a heart attack that afternoon. He died at 1:45 p.m. Surrounded by his caregiver and wife, Ida, he was able to give a bit of humor in his last minutes. With a little smile, he remarked, "I wish I was skiing." He said, "No, but I'd rather be skiing than doing what I'm doing," in response to the question of whether he had ever gone skiing. It was a peaceful, almost fun conclusion to a life that had brought millions of people happiness. He had clung to the memories of an unreplaceable partnership for almost 10 years, preferring seclusion to the limelight. With his death, Laurel and Hardy, the pair that had once made the world laugh more than anybody else, came to an end.